And then reading from the Gospel according to Matthew, the 12th chapter, beginning at the first verse. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath." He said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which it's not lawful for him or his companions to eat, but only the priests. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and yet are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. But if you'd known what this means, 'I desire mercy and not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." He left that place and entered the synagogue. A man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, "Is it lawful to cure on the Sabbath?" So that they might accuse him. He said to them, "Suppose one of you has only one sheep, and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath. Will you not lay hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a human being than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." And then he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and it was restored as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him how to destroy him. The word of the Lord. Keeping Sabbath has always been one of the hallmarks of being Jewish. It set them apart from other peoples. And it still is the basis for our 7-day week. It's a practice that many Christians have continued, although because of the resurrection we choose Sunday rather than Saturday. My Scottish grandmother was very strict about it, and not only for herself. In her growing up, her family walked to church rather than take the trolley because they didn't want to make other people work. That's one of the reasons the Amish don't use electricity. They don't want to make other people work on the Sabbath. So often we think of keeping the Sabbath as drudgery. All those things you can't do. My husband tells me that his father was a Sabbath keeper and spent the whole day with a really bad headache. But where in your life do you just put it all down and give yourself time to simply be? To refrain from work is not a limitation, but a gift. Sabbath, writes Dorothy Bass, is a recurring testimony against the drudgery of slavery. Think about all those folk to whom the Torah first came. Remember the circumstances? They had just come out of the relentless toil of slavery. No days off, no national holidays, no weekends, no vacations, no retirement. Occasionally there would be a festival, but mostly it was just work and work and work and more work. And then comes the law. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male or female slave or your ox or your donkey or any of your livestock or the resident alien in your towns, so that your male and female slave may rest as well as you. It's pretty inclusive, isn't it? Everything stops. Everybody has time off. So, what about us today? Most of us read this story from Matthew, and there are others like it, and think, well, Jesus is breaking the rules, and so we don't have to worry about keeping the Sabbath. I wonder, is that really true? Or is Jesus somehow redefining how we keep Sabbath? Take the first instance. The disciples are, plucking grain, rolling it around so that the chaff blows away, feeding themselves, refreshing themselves. And what happens in the second story? The man with the withered hand is healed. Healing and refreshment. It's not about laws, says Jesus. It's about healing and refreshment. And that's the point that Rob Bell makes in this 4th chapter of his book, Velvet Elvis. He talks about his own driven nature and how he finally just ran out of energy. On the surface, everything was going well. This little church he'd started had grown and thrived beyond his wildest dreams. But he knew that was only on the surface. On the inside, he had nothing left to give to all those people. He was burned out. And he really wanted to quit and just walk away from it all. But he found another way. He began to observe a Sabbath. And when he did that, he discovered the healing and refreshment that God intended Sabbath to give. Listen to what he discovered. Sabbath is taking a day to remind myself that I did not make the world and that it really will continue to exist without my efforts. Sabbath is a day when my work is done, even if it isn't. Sabbath is a day when my job is to enjoy, period. Sabbath is a day when I'm fully available to myself and to those I love the most. Sabbath is a day when I remember that God made the world, and God saw that it was good. Sabbath is a day when I remind myself that I am not a machine. Sabbath is a day when at the end I say, I didn't do anything today. And I don't add, and I feel so guilty. You know, the rabbis had all kinds of rules about what you can and can't do on the Sabbath, and they still do. Jesus sets us free from somebody else's rules. You know, if, like John's father, they give you a headache, then set your own rules. Jesus showed us that there's more than one way to keep Sabbath. But, this is a really important but, he did not do away with the Sabbath. You know, the question really becomes one of priorities. What rules our lives? How do we make that a deliberate choice instead of something that just happens? And certainly there is enough that conspires against it. You know, the old blue laws are gone. Stores are open on Sunday, as is just about everything else. Roust out your kids for church on Sunday, and probably their friends are playing in your backyard. The soccer games and the swim meets no longer avoid Sunday. They start, we don't start until noon, except it takes an hour to get there. And we all know the classic bit about, finding God on the golf course. Although I have reason to suspect that when Jesus Christ is named, it's not usually with a sense of awe and wonder. And now that most women hold jobs outside, one at home and one in the outside world, it's really hard to catch up on everything. And let's face it, sometimes, at least in my house, doing the laundry or running the vacuum seems like a choice demanded by the Board of Health. In this day of crowded schedules, isn't keeping Sabbath something we can no longer afford? I would argue that in this day of crowded schedules and multiple demands, Sabbath is something we need more than ever. We need a time of rest and recovery and refocus. We need to keep our priorities straight or we will never survive. So my challenge to you is to try keeping Sabbath for 1 month. And what might that look like in your life? I mean, let's face it, you might object if I said, I don't work on Sunday. But I'll tell you what I don't do and what I do. I only shop when it's an emergency. That's my Scottish grandmother's doing. But the reality is there are enough other ways of going to do that. It really isn't an inconvenience. I read books. I do the crossword puzzle. I call my kids. I have time for my husband. It's a quiet afternoon, and when it's over, I really am refreshed. So what might you do to set that day apart? Set some boundaries for yourself about what you don't do and what you do. What are the things that refresh and renew you? Read, walk, visit with friends. Try it for a month. And you know, if Sunday doesn't work for you and you've got to work, find another day. But do try to find a day that's just for you and your family. You know, New Year's Day is a time when so many of us make resolutions about how we're going to improve our lives and do better this year. And how long do they last? Jews had a way to remind themselves of their commitment to keep the Sabbath. Tassels. Blue tassels like a string around your finger to help you remember the commitment you make. If you ever go to a synagogue, you'll see rabbis put their prayer shawl on. It still has blue. So make yourself a tassel, something that will help you remember that for this month you're going to do it differently. Mark it on your calendar in a bright color. Do something. Try it. And tell me what it was like. Amen.